I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
The history of canon, because this is where if I'm remembering correctly, I've read some interviews with you, I've listened to you talk, I've looked into canon. He cannot, of course, convince the American communists of Trotsky's critique, right? The lights don't go off when he.
He convinces some, particularly those who'd worked closely with him in the International Labor Defense. People like his lifelong partner Rose Carstner, who was a woman of substance in the communist movement with a long history. Max Shackman, who was a major figure, cosmopolitan, spoke many languages, had been sort of schooled by canon in the International Labor Defense, and Martin Abern, who'd been a leader of the youth wing of the communist movement. Those were won over fairly quickly.
Where was Paul Burnham in this period? Was he involved? Burnham?
Who?
Paul Burnham. Not Paul
uh,
Burnham, but
no,
Burnham, the guy who
Burnham,
came up with
who wrote the Managerial Revolution.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. No, he was. This is a philosophy professor at NYU, aligned with Sidney Hook. They would be part of
James Burnham, not Paul. James. Burnham, right? Yeah.
Yes, they would be part of the emerging Trotskyist figures in the mid to late 1930s, and they would, and Burnham would join with Cannon. He had been in A.J. Musty's organization, the Workers' Party, in the mid 1930s.
But that's down the road. But right now, Shackman,
Abern, Carstner, and little groups, ones and twos of others, were won immediately not immediately, but over a few weeks to Cannon's position on the important document that Trotsky had written. And remember, this is a fragment of the body of literature that Trotsky would ultimately produce.
Right.
But when it comes out, as it does, that Cannon and company are embracing these Trotskyist views, then the leadership of the American Party, headed by Jay Lovestone at the time, who was a supporter of Bukharin, not of Stalin, and that has some ramifications that we'll get to later, probably. They decide to put Cannon, Abern, and Shackman on trial.
Wow.
So they do so, and it is a long, drawn-out trial, which is interesting. It lasts over the course of a few weeks, and the sessions are marathon sessions that go on for hours and hours. And eventually a lot of Communist Party members are allowed in as an audience.
What was what were they being charged with that they were being put on trial? What bylaws in the organization allowed them to be put on trial for embracing Trotsky's position?
I don't think there were any bylaws, but
right.
Trotsky had become, at this point, such a heretical figure in the Stalinist common term that embracing the views of Trotsky were anathema. So it was likened basically to to the equivalent of embracing a capitalist ideology.
But back in the 19th century, when there was a split between Bernstein and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, or the first, not Bernstein, but in the past, in the First International, you wouldn't put people on trial; you would have debates, right?
Well,
I mean, what happened to communism in the meantime? That rather than there being an open debate within the organization,
the short answer is Stalinism.
Yeah,
and its increasingly repressive turn. For instance, what Cannon and those aligned with him wanted when they were put on trial was simply for the membership to be given access to the relevant documents and to have open discussion and debate.
Right.
This was vetoed out of the realm of the possible. Right. Not only that, there were those who gravitated to Cannon, like almost the entire Minneapolis local, a very significant sector of Minneapolis's leading communists, gravitated to Cannon, not on the basis of knowing what Trotskyism was. They said quite openly when they wrote to the party in New York, we don't know what Trotskyism is. And then they said, and that's the problem. We simply want to read the documents. They were expelled. So Cannon organized some people, and Lovestone and the leadership of the Communist Party organized others by pushing them out and pushing them towards Cannon. And then there were, clots of little entities, a group of Hungarians who had long kind of thought Trotsky was okay, but who had been quiet, came to Cannon. Some people associated with Ammertorg, which was the Soviet trade agency, gravitated around a figure there who was open to Trotsky. So by ones and twos, by groups of 10, by people expelled, a Boston doctor, Antoinette Conoco, had long been an opponent of, not on the same basis as Cannon and others, of Soviet bureaucracy, was basically expelled by Lovestone at the drop of a hat. And she was pushed towards Cannon. But the long drawn out trial allowed a bit of this to happen. And one reason it was a long drawn out trial was that, and again, this relates to Stalinism and factionalization. Lovestone thought, well, Cannon and Foster, well, in different factions, have been in some senses close because they both had interlocking trade union interests, unlike Lovestone, who had far less of that. And what the Lovestone leadership wanted to do was tar Foster with the brush of Cannon's Trotskyism. And so they let the whole thing play out in order to try to draw Foster, into the circle, because Lovestone understood that he was the major figure in the party that might give him, a run for his money, a challenge. Of course, the denouement of this is that Lovestone backed the wrong horse in 1928-29, aligning with Bukharin, who, after the 1928 Congress, Stalin moved decisively to marginalize, isolate, and indeed, in the end, imprison and worse. Lovestone was soon expelled from the Communist Party, and Browder was installed at that point as the leader to further emasculate, in some senses, Foster once Lovestone and Cannon were gone. And by that point, into the 1930s, the Communist Party has in some senses been thoroughly Stalinized and cleansed of its potential dissidents. And Cannon and company consider themselves, while expelled, to be an external faction of the Communist Party. This was the Trotskyist orientation to the Comintern at this point in time. They were not a separate organization. They were, by necessity, expelled, but by necessity, they saw themselves appealing to communists first. So their publications were all gravitating towards that, towards trying to win back the Communist Party to the politics of revolution. But they were met with vitriol, violence. Stalinist gangs would hound Cannon and Shackman and others whenever they spoke at workers' forums. There were often the police had to be called in. I mean, it got so ridiculous that I think it was a Minneapolis meeting that Cannon was speaking at. The communists broke up a meeting, and a young communist league figure, when the cops came, yelled from the back of the room, "Arrest him! He's a counter-revolutionary." So, can you imagine a member of the Communist Party, calling on the cops to arrest a former leader of the Communist Party for being a counter-revolutionary? I mean,
Yeah, unfortunately, I can imagine that all too easily. But yeah, so that effort that Cannon was making to win back the Communist Party was ultimately a failure, right? And he decided to form a new organization that would address the working class instead. Is that where that went?
Really, by the mid 1930s, it was. I mean, Cannon clung to and adhered to would be a better term. Adhered to Trotsky's view. This was Trotsky's understanding of how the new, what the way his forces should operate on a global scale. Cannon adhered to the notion that we must appeal to the Communist Party first and foremost. We can recruit others, but really what we know that the most advanced sectors of the working class are still in the Communist Party. That's whom we should be trying to recruit. The sort of axe fell on that on that political orientation in the mid 1930s when the rise of fascism in Germany really revealed just how the Stalinized Comintern was no longer a revolutionary force. It could no longer be considered such. The Stalinized Comintern squandered so much with its sectarian third period. This is 1929 to 1935. View that it and it alone led the revolutionary forces. All others on the left were social fascists and needed to be basically exorcised from the workers' movement. That the only people who could lead were those, in the leadership of the Communist Party. And what this did in Germany was sacrifice the powerful German workers' movements to Hitler, because instead of having a united front, which is what Lenin would have always argued needed to be done, of communists, social democrats, and even honest, well-meaning liberals against fascism so that Hitler could be stopped. The Communist Party had this notion: we are the leadership. First Hitler, then us. Hitler would be so bad that the workers would turn instinctually towards the Communist Party. Well, instead, what happened was the powerful German Communist Party was destroyed. It was the first in Hitler's repressive onslaught. Homosexuals, Jews, but first were the communists. That's who he got rid of first. And so once Trotsky saw that sort of denouement, tragic denouement unfold, he said, okay, we can no longer appeal to the members of the Comintern as our comrades. We have to build outside of them. If they want to come to us as we make gains in the working classes, we, organize on a mass level, fine. But we cannot follow the, tail after trying to recruit them to our revolutionary ideas anymore. So Cannon really went along with that, as did the rest of the elements of the group that they had founded, the Communist League of America, bracket opposition. And they began to make inroads into mass work. And they made, they played a major role in an important hotel strike in New York City in 1933, 34. And what really put them on the map was the Minneapolis Trotskyists organized the, three major strikes of Teamsters in 1934. And they took what was a decrepit craft union led by some of the most reactionary trade union leaders in the U.S., Dan Tobin. They took that from an organization that in Minneapolis probably had no more than 150 members in 1932 to an organization that had fought a major industrial strike that sort of prefaced the CIO campaigns of the later 1930s. And they grew that union from about 150 to 7,000 people in the space
Was
of a few
was the
years.
Stalinized American Communist Party doing that kind of work, or helping with strikes and organizing workers?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, they were much stronger than the Trotskyists
Yeah.
in the in working in workers and trade union activity. I would argue, however, that the Minneapolis strike, because of its leadership, its coherence, its astute reflection of the realities of the situation, was actually a far more successful strike than anything the communists led. But to give the communists credit, in 1934 they led with Harry Bridges a major strike of West Coast longshoremen and seamen. They were very active in leading, rarely successful, but it was a very difficult context, mill workers in the American South. And among, a whole sector of workers, coal miners, etc., they had far more of a presence than the Trotskyists. So, and this was part of the difficulty the Trotskyists faced. They were minuscule in numbers compared with the much larger Communist Party.
Right. I want to go back a step and ask about Trotsky himself again. Often enough, people, liberals will say that there's a continuity from Lenin through Trotsky to Stalin, that the Russian Revolution was bound to fail from the start. We've been hearing the story that cuts against that. Because of the internal struggle within the Communist Party, you can see that there were different tendencies. There were possibilities for other, outcomes. There was a difference in vision. But what would you say defines the difference between Trotsky's view? I mean, I guess it's the internationalism, right? That would define the difference. We went over it before. But what is the general reason that people would give for there being a continuity from the Leninist revolution, the Bolsheviks, through Stalin, and how does Trotsky counter that claim? Maybe this is an opportune time to ask that question, but I kind of have the desire to ask it now.
Yeah, well, it's very a very important question. And it's actually at the core of why I ended up writing about Cannon, because the historiography of the American Communist Party is very much in this mode, I think, of Leninism equals Stalinism equals the failure of the revolutionary possibility in the United States. Cannon, as we've been talking, cuts against that grain because there's two sides to this this historiography. One is associated with an older figure who wrote in the 50s and early 60s named Theodore Draper, who wrote two very important books on American communism. And Draper was himself a communist at one time and knew the movement quite intimately, but had come to the conclusion, as he became a kind of liberal Cold War warrior in the 50s, that communism was necessarily a foreign import. And it was never going to really, coming from Moscow, it was never going to really garner the support of the American working class. And he saw, Leninism, ultimately he saw Leninism as the, equivalent of Stalinism. There were new left influenced historians writing who came out of the 60s, who in some senses saw their work challenging Draper. And they viewed American communism not as an import, but as the expression of an indigenous American radicalism, and they tended to study not the international developments but the local, configurations.
And when you say indigenous, you mean coming out of the?
I don't mean native. I mean,
Right. Coming out of the bourgeois revolution in America.
Coming out of American conditions and born in America, et cetera.
Right.
They produced a great deal of very interesting and good work, but a lot of these new left historians also tended to embrace the notion that ultimately, Leninism had an affinity with or a connection with Stalinism. And
what would they say that connection was, or that affinity was?
I think it would be tied to understandings of democracy and validating, in some senses, sometimes even unconsciously, American democracy and its sort of privileged station. And there were very few of the new leftists who would embrace, for instance, the notion of a vanguard party and the necessity of a vanguard party, and who really seriously grappled with, the governance of that vanguard party and the meaning of democratic centralism, for instance. They saw this as really, in some senses, how should I put it? Not that it was un-American necessarily, but that it violated American, sensibilities of democratic procedure and individualism, and the importance of individuals.
What was the theory of central? Why is that theory of centralism so significant? What is it about that is needed in order to overcome capitalism, to have a revolutionary struggle? Why? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that what Lenin was the continuity with Marx, but with an appreciation of the organizational imperative, that the necessity of creating a disciplined party that could, in fact, draw its ranks together to pose, in confrontation, a possible alternative to capitalist, society and its organizations. I mean, the disciplines of capital are quite pronounced, and its organizational capacities are anything but, underdeveloped. And you needed a developed party. Now, this meant that and a democratic centralist party like the Bolsheviks in 1917, and like the practice of the governance of the Bolsheviks in the very early period of the Russian Revolution, there was centralization, but there was also democracy in terms of free discussion within the party, within party circles. But then there was the realization that when the party decided, through its democratic procedures, on a particular programmatic position, on a particular line of orientation, that had to be carried out. You couldn't have a debating society, in the midst of the kind of revolution that the Bolsheviks were fighting.
And you couldn't have like a system where some parts of the International would claim something like states' rights and ignore what was coming from the central democratic organization of the party, and say, "Oh no, we're right."
I mean,
Right.
And one must remember that Lenin and his comrades fought a revolution against repressive Tsarist state, and confronted an amalgamated capitalist opposition. They didn't have that luxury, and Cannon and Trotsky as well embraced too this notion of party discipline. It didn't mean that they believed in suppressing discussion the way Stalin came, to operate in the late 1920s and after. This didn't sit well with a lot of new left historians of the 60s and early 70s. But one reason I wrote about Cannon is because, and what neither the Draper approach nor the new left approach ever addressed was how fundamentally different Stalinism was from Leninism on these questions. And so Cannon is, in some senses, a reflection of an American who comes to embrace the Leninist view, experiences the Stalinist degeneration, opts for and aligns with the Trotskyist alternative. And
from a very American perspective, as part of an American
absolutely struggle. From a very American, from really from the bowels of the American capitalist experience.
Right.
That's where Cannon's coming from, and that's the milieu that he never left, nor did he ever really want to. So, in some senses, the key problem with the notion that Leninism equals Stalinism is that it reads backwards from Stalinist atrocity to some of the authoritarian measures that Lenin had to take in the context of 1917 to 1921, which, he might well later have come to regret the necessity of that, but he never would have denied the necessity of it. I mean, the Cheka, the Cheka under Lenin was not what it became under Stalin, but you had to have a police force when, for instance, social revolutionaries in another party were trying to assassinate the leader of the Bolshevik state. When anarchists were and there was a great affinity between where anarchists wanted to get to and where Lenin wanted to get to, as evidenced in the State and Revolution. But the difference was Lenin saw a transition, right? That you had to actually defeat capitalism at the level of the state and at the level of the economy. And that took some time before you could actually implement, the free society of the individual that both the anarchists and Leninists see as the end product of revolutionary agitation.
Well, I have a question about some Trotskyists that were influential on me down the line, but I want to get to it in a minute. But before I let you go, I want to ask you about what you think of CLR James and Raya Dostoevskaya, because I actually came out of a Marxist humanist group at one point, and I just want to get your opinion on that. But before we get to that, remind me to get to it if I don't remember. But before we get to that, let's go back to the Cannon when he is following Trotsky, like Trotskyism in America. This is the moment we're in with Cannon, I think, in the story that you're telling. And how did the Trotskyist organizations form? What was Cannon's role? Was there more than one? Were there at that point sects around Trotsky, or was it just one Trotskyist version of the party in America? And there, I'll stop asking questions.
No, neither internationally nor in America would I say was there simply one Trotskyist template. Right. And with Cannon, he, Shackman, and Abraham and Karstner formed the Communist League of America bracket opposition as an external faction of the American Communist Party.
But at that moment, there were others in America, other organizations that were Trotskyist? No, I wouldn't say so. There may have been individuals here or there who might have embraced some aspect of Trotskyism, but didn't join in the Communist League of America. I mean, one of them would have been Max Eastman, who was, who was a former editor of the Masses and Liberator, and was aligned with Trotsky very early, but was never really an organizational man. He was more of a kind of bohemian radical, and he would move to the right, of course, as time went on.
But the Communist League of America opposition was the center of Trotskyist organization from its founding in 1929 into the early 1930s. Then there began to be others who embraced aspects of Trotskyism, but could not quite find their way to be stalwart members of the Communist League of America opposition. People like Albert Weisbord, who was a former communist who had led the Passaic strike in 1927. An economist who worked on Wall Street for a while named B.J. Field, who played a role in leading the hotel workers' strike. And both of these sought entry into the Communist League of America. Weisbord never made it in, although he went to see Trotsky, and Trotsky had some positive kind of assessments of him. Field was in and out and eventually expelled for misleadership. But neither of these people, Weisbord or Field, ended up keeping the faith, if you will, with Trotskyism. They eventually broke with it. Now, as the Communist League of America moved moved into more mass activity, like the Minneapolis strike of 1934, Cannon and others, and Trotsky was at this point moving towards breaking from, keeping, an external relation.
Where was Trotsky at this point? Where was he located?
In 1934, he was in Turkey. He would be in France for a while. Then he would be in Norway for a while. Eventually, he would make his way to Mexico in the late 1930s. And the American movement played a big role in facilitating that movement of him to Mexico. But at this point, by the early 1930s, Cannon and others were seeing the need to actually link up with other revolutionary forces. 1934 was critical because in 1934, not only did the Trotskyists lead the Minneapolis Teamsters strikes, but a radicalizing, revolutionizing minister named A.J. Muste, who'd been a pacifist during World War II, was coming more and more to revolutionary politics. And he'd formed a workers' party, the American Workers' Party. And they had led a major strike in Toledo of auto parts workers. And they were very active in the unemployed movement. The Great Depression was moving more and more radicals towards revolutionary politics. And and Muste was reading less theology and more Trotsky. And was engaging in less in speeches from the pulpit and more in actually quite militant picket line, sometimes quite violent activity. Cannon and others in the Communist League of America, they end up fusing with the Muste group. And this, of course, expands and develops the numbers of people in the Trotskyist movement and wins important people like Burnham to Trotskyism, and many, many more, and many workers too. It wasn't just the odd philosophy professor from NYU who gravitated.
Right.
And many of the so this is a real expansion of Trotskyism's forces. Then as they merge into the Workers' Party, the American Workers' Party and the Communist League of America form the Workers' Party. At that point, Trotsky has moved away from the notion that this is an external tendency, right? And Trotsky adopts in 1935-36 what he calls the French turn. in which he advocates that his followers in France enter the Socialist Party. There's a whole series of reasons why he suggests this, including trying to nullify the influence of Stalinism, including to try to grow and expand the party. And the Americans follow this with an entry into the Socialist Party, where Cannon plays a decisive role.
Back into the old SPA.
Back into the Socialist Party, at that point led by Norman Thomas.
Yeah.
And again, what you have to appreciate is that one reason to do this is that while the Socialist Party remained, in some senses, a rather tepid organization, and while it had all kinds of problems, it was a mass party, and it was attracting young youth and militant workers to its ranks. And they were far to the left of the leadership of Norman Thomas and others.
Right.
And Cannon and others saw the possibilities of, moving into that circle, working with the socialists, working as part.
And what year was this again that this was happening?
36,
okay, so this is well after the moment where, at least after the moment where you're no longer aiming at the Communist Party. You're not trying to win back.
Gone.
That's long gone, which means that thinking of the Soviet Union as having potential is also long gone. Is there still hope that the Soviet experiment will be turned into a real workers' state, a real workers' revolution amongst the Trotskyists at this point? Or are they thinking that there will have to be a revolution in the Soviet Union?
They never lost the hope that the Soviet Union could be turned around.
Okay.
And they always saw, and Trotsky died seeing this, that the Soviet Union still had socialized property forms that were the gains of the revolution. Yes, a degenerate caste now stood atop bureaucratically the leadership of the Soviet Union, its Communist Party, and its Communist International. But what was required was a political revolution of the workers to seize back that political control. But the Soviet Union was always regarded, for instance, as something that still needed to be defended against capitalism and, for instance, imperialism, in terms of aggression against it. But so that, it was a degenerate workers' state that could still be rehabilitated into a healthy worker state, but you needed to basically have a political revolution that would actually displace the forces that were leading to that degeneration.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question that I will probably want to let drop pretty quickly, but what about the state capitalist critique of the Soviet Union? And there's a couple of different versions of it. There's, I think, the Cliffite version of it, and then there's one I kind of align with, which is the Forrest Johnson or the Johnson-Forrest tendencies critique. That came later down the road, where they thought the Soviet Union was essentially capitalist and not socialist at all, not meaning it wasn't even part of a transitionary move to communism, or communism itself. I mean, that's where some Trotskyists ended up. So I guess I'm not asking you what Cannon thought, I'm asking, I guess, what you think about this idea that the Soviet Union was, by say 36, already state capitalist. Would you yourself reject that idea?
I'd reject that idea. Yeah. And I'd reject that idea because of really what I said before is that if you have an appreciation of the hierarchy of struggles that are required to transform a society, the gains that were registered in October of 1917, the socialization of the means of production, and the way that and that lived on. It degenerated, yes, the political leadership, the decision making in productive apparatuses as well as in the political sphere. Sure, but the Soviet Union was as a consequence in 1936 and in 1940-41 far closer to the possibility of being rehabilitated into a healthy worker state than was any capitalist state that required a revolution that simultaneously had to basically exercise the power of capital at the point of production and the authority of a political leadership.
So by the nationalization of industry, is that what we're talking about? That's what
we're talking about, the socialization of the means of production. Yes, that you don't have private ownership of
right. Okay, yeah,
and
right.
so
And so now that's the, I mean, and that's where the state capitalist thesis. That's what they're questioning, is whether or not that amounts to socialization, or whether the state can actually function like a private capitalist. Right. That would be where CLR James and Rydoyskaya would disagree.
Yes, and Shackman later, in a different, his notion of bureaucratic collectivism, et cetera, it had a similar but different, orientation.
Yeah.
My take, I was actually in Russia in 2000, and you could still see remnants then, that late, of the socialization of the productive apparatus. And what I would come at the variants of state capitalism with is that if in 1936, for instance, Russia was this state capitalist entity, then what was all the hoopla about? With the transformation of Russia much later. I would see that as the transition to capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
The events that started in the 80s and that really was at 1989 when the ultimate collapse happens. I mean, that's when capitalism in Russia is restored.
Well, that's when when Russia is brought into the neoliberal order. The modernized capitalism is what that's my answer. It's okay. That's what the hoopla was about. It was the final death of Fordism, even in the Soviet Union, and the incorporation of the Soviet Union into the neoliberal order, and then which turns into a horror show right away. For
yes,
people in Russia,
right, yeah,
but that would be my nuanced answer to that question. But we'll put that aside. I want to hear the history more, and I do think that you're helping me to challenge my own preconceptions as I hear the full story. I mean, to a little bit of my background, I came out of like Noam Chomsky style Pacific Northwest anarchism. So the most degenerate form of the left would be the Pacific Northwest part, not the Chomsky part. And
you might find some opponents to that view.
right. But anyway, so like in the 90s when I was young, that's the kind of thinking I had as someone who wanted to be a communist, and it took me until the economic crisis of 2008 to even give Marx a fair hearing, so I'm 51 years old trying to catch up for a wayward leftist career, I guess. So back to Cannon though. I want to hear about like what happened after World War II. Maybe I'm skipping ahead too quickly here, but what happened with Shackman and Cannon and the split that came later on? What happened to the attempt to organize around an American Trotskyism?
Well, I think the just to backtrack a bit, after the Trotskyists who have fused with the Mustyites enter the Socialist Party and then are expelled from the Socialist Party.
Right.
They form the Socialist Workers' Party in 1938. This is the first full-blown American Trotskyist organization that quickly aligns with Trotsky's Fourth International later in the summer of 1938. And at that point, they've grown from an organization of a few hundred to an organization of a couple of thousand. And they have a trade union wing, an important presence through the Minneapolis Teamsters. They are making inroads into, certain unions, and they're engaging in what you would expect a revolutionary organization to do. World War II emerges and breaks out. This causes a rupture. It's called the Shackman-Burnham fight of 1939-40. Shackman was originally with Cannon in opposing Burnham's views, but it turns on precisely this question of the Soviet Union that you've been talking about. Is the Soviet Union a worker state, albeit degenerated, or is it some other kind of state? And as early as 1938, which Shackman very much disagreed with Burnham on this, Burnham was claiming that if he had to judge the Soviet Union and its state form, he would say it was not a worker state as early as 1938. And of course, Trotsky's last factional battle is with Burnham and company. This splits. Ultimately, it splits the Socialist Workers' Party. Shackman takes a considerable section of the youth, although not all. Many of the more trade union-oriented types stay with Cannon. And the Socialist Workers' Party moves into the 1940s, where it is going to face the worst repression of the bourgeois state.
What's the difference between, in Shackman's mind and Burnham's mind and Cannon's mind, between a worker state and what Marx and Lenin might have called the dictatorship of the proletariat? Is there a difference?
Ultimately, no.
Okay.
No. I don't think so. The key difference that emerged was in attributing the stature of a workers' state, however degenerate, to the Soviet Union in 1939-40 was for Shackman, it seems to me, political, and for Cannon and Trotsky, economic. I mean, they saw this, the collectivization of the means of production to be the de-defining feature
Right.
of a workers'
The
state.
collectivization with the support of the state, and then the transformation. I would think of the part with the dictatorship of the proletariat would be where the proletariat transforms the means of production away from the capitalist form based on abstract labor time mediating relationships between commodities to ones which are directly socialized through the workers' relations themselves and their own productive work.
Yeah.
That would be the dictatorship of the proletariat being empowered would be where the proletariat took up the means of production and transformed them rather than, simply using the state to organize the capitalist form of production and exchange. That's my highly sectarian MHI Andrew Kleiman view of what the dictatorship of the proletariat would be, and which is, to add another wrinkle to it, he didn't necessarily, Kleiman doesn't even support dictatorship of the proletariat as far as I know. So I don't know what I'm talking about exactly in terms of doctrine, but that's how I think of it.
Yeah. I mean, I would just add that I think you can have a worker state without having what, Lenin, Trotsky, and others would have considered the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right.
The dictatorship of the proletariat being essentially a political question, a worker state being a state that is in transition towards that, hopefully.
Okay.
And they recognized that the hopefully was not happening.
Because it's funny, because that dictatorship of the proletariat move is the moment, however long it lasts, where the state and the proletariat together transform the means of production, and at the other side of it, you have something like communism, where you actually, from each according to their ability to each according to their means. So the worker state is a transition from capitalism to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which again is a transition to communism. I guess. But in any case, back to the history here. The breakup between Shackman and Burnham and Cannon, and Burnham was a kind of a newcomer, but he was significant in this period, right? He had a major journal that he was associated with.
Well, he was the editor of the Trotskyist, along with Shackman, of the New International, which was the Trotskyist theoretical journal. He was an important figure, but he was always mercurial, and his time was short-lived in the Trotskyist movement. And once he moved out of it, he moved very quickly to the right.
Right.
Shackman took a while longer, but he moved to the right as well.
Yeah.
Another reason I'm attracted to Cannon is because he did not move to the right.
Right. Where did Shackman end up over time? Like, what was his move to the right characterized by?
Well, I would locate it exactly in this question of, is the Soviet Union in 1940 defensible as a worker state?
Mm-hmm.
Because, for instance, where Shackman ended up is he founds the Workers' Party in the 1940s. He remains a Trotskyist. He, in fact, is closer to Trotsky's widow than anyone else, Natalia. But by the 1950s, he's moving more and more into the ambit of, the sort of trade union bureaucracy, and in particular, its international, orientation and connections to emerging trade union movements in Latin America and Africa, et cetera. And by the 1960s, he actually endorses the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Wow.
On the grounds that, and again, this is why I say it all goes back to, on the grounds that Cuba, which would be defended by Trotskyists like Cannon as a deformed worker state, i.e., it never really started as a healthy worker state, but nevertheless, it did collectivize property forms, it socialized production, etc. It was a beginning. And this is why I say it's political with Shackman and not. He judged America to be far superior in terms of its democratic rights to individuals.
More potential for socialism in America than in Cuba.
Right. And so, to me, that is the slippery slope of the third campus kind of positions.
But anyone supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion, though, on any grounds, is saying, I think that you have to be a Posadist to support that. You know who Posada? You have to be saying only after nuclear war can we have socialism, because that was such a terribly risky and irresponsible political move. I feel like, but I was raised under Reagan, so my fear of nuclear war is, deep. But
this was Shackman's trajectory, and
right.
It is a slope.
Right.
In my view.
Right. And Cannon, after the split. Did Shackman go back a step? Did Cannon and Shackman stand against Burnham, or did Shackman and Burnham stand against Cannon?
Well, in the very beginnings of this fight, this faction fight, Cannon and Shackman were together.
Right.
And, Shackman opposed Burnham, as did Trotsky vehemently. Much of the debate turned on dialectics, which Trotsky adhered to and Burnham rejected. But then the fundamental and decided point was around the nature of the Soviet Union. And eventually, in this debate, as it evolved and came to its head in 1940, Shackman and Burnham were together. Shackman is, the leading element in the Workers' Party. Burnham very quickly makes his exit from Trotskyism. And C.L.R. James, who you mentioned earlier, who was a very talented, figure and contributed a great deal, was in and out of both positions, sort of, over the course of the 40s. Went to was in the Workers' Party for a while, kind of nudged back towards Cannon and the Socialist Workers' Party, before eventually, moving into his own ambit with the Forrest Johnson tendency.
Right.
But in the interlude, Cannon and the Socialist Workers' Party and the Minneapolis Teamsters in particular faced the onslaught of the state and its repressive apparatus, and the entire leadership of the Minneapolis Trotskyists and of the SWP is jailed in 1940 with a conviction in 1941. They appeal it. They go to jail in 1943 or 44. Cannon serves, I think, 16 months in jail for opposition to imperialist war, but really for charged under the Smith Act. It's for it's for a variety of activities that really go back to the 30s and Teamsters militancy. And they come out of that, and there's more factionalism. There's a fight with Goldman and Morrow over the question of democratic centralism, and then there's a fight in the 1950s, which is Cannon's last major faction fight around largely international questions and Pabloism, which is basically the notion that Trotskyism has to be essentially buried because the world has moved in the era of McCarthyism and conservatism on such a plane that the best we can do is in some senses align with the already existing Stalinist world parties and forego the possibility of any struggle that will kind of lead to a revolution in the Soviet Union. And Cannon basically after that point is in retirement, but it's a kind of tortured retirement in that he can never quite, refrain from throwing his 2 cents into various debates and discussions.
Well, you said that these come down to political questions rather than theoretical questions, like around the Soviet Union, like because you can judge them, I guess, but I guess based on their political outcomes, like. You can see Shackman's endorsement of the Bay of Pigs, which is clearly wrong, of a right-wing political stance as the outcome of his political judgment about the Soviet Union, and that this can be judged on the level of politics. With Burnham, it's interesting, though, because he ended up going, I think, to the right even of Shackman. And it stemmed from a theoretical judgment, which I always thought, from what I've read of the book, The Managerial Revolution, just seemed to me to be a rejection of Marxism altogether, and of a conception of what capitalism was that would be informed by Marx, because he pretended as though the Fordist capitalist order wasn't capitalist anymore. Like, not only was the Soviet Union not state capitalism, but FDR's America wasn't capitalist either. Whenever monopoly powers emerged, that wouldn't be capitalist either. And his concern was to protect the entrepreneurial capitalist class from these encroaching fascist monopolist managers who weren't even capitalist. Do you think that, so my question at the end of all this is, can you see a difference? Is there a way to judge the politics and the theory together? Can we, how do we balance out the question of the theoretical description of capitalism and the political decisions that have to be made?
Yeah, I should clarify, since I think maybe either I misspoke or it isn't coming across clearly. I wasn't saying that the issues were that I wasn't meaning to say that there was a hiving off of the conceptual and the theoretical from the political. What I was saying was that in the judgment of whether or not the Soviet Union was a worker state, Cannon and Trotsky put the accent of judgment on the economic relations within that Soviet Union.
Right.
Whereas it seems to me that Shackman and Burnham put the accent on the political.
I see. I got you now. I understand.
On the ways in which the politics of that society worked. And This is important because what I was also saying earlier on is, if you are making, you can never hive off the political and the economic in terms of any revolutionary process.
Right.
I'm not saying that. But if you've already gotten the society and its revolutionary potential past the hurdle of privatized property, and a regime of accumulation rooted in capital, and you've taken it towards collectivizing and socializing the means of production, then that's a foundation that cannot be cavalierly dismissed in a judgment of is this a worker state or not. You can say it's a worker state on the basis of the means of production being collectivized, but you can say it's a degenerate worker state in terms of the political, authority within that society resting with people who do not have the interests of the working class or the interests of world revolution, or even the basic interests of running the economy in a both an efficient and a class oriented way. So it was really that Burnham and Shackman, I'm vulgarizing here, but it was really in 39-40 that Burnham and Shackman did not like the political decisions that the Stalinist leadership of the Communist International was making. Nobody in the Trotskyist movement did, but there were those who then said, okay, we don't like them and we know that they're wrong and we counter them in every way we can, but we will defend it as a worker state against imperialist aggression. And Shackman and company, it seems to me, said, we don't make that choice. We're not willing to defend it anymore because politically it's so repugnant.
Yeah. It's kind of a beautiful soul syndrome going on,
which is exactly the same position Shackman would have in the early 1960s with the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
We might as well have an America take it over, because politically, what Castro's doing is repugnant.
Right.
So that's a somewhat different, I think, tilt than where you were.
Yeah, no, it's completely different because I'm basing it my limited understanding here and my position, which I want to be able to modify. It's not like this isn't my dogma. I swear, I mean, although I treat it like one some of the time. Um, um, Based on my understanding of how what capital is, the necessity of the legal form of private property as opposed to the kind of property that is produced through the commodity form, that kind of stuff. But the the thing I want to ask you at the end here, because we've talked for about 2 hours, a little over, is where do you feel like canon is relevant today for people who are wanting to struggle for socialism after the last decade or more of complete absurdity, I think, on the left. Where could canon help? Like the people who are coming out of the social democratic turn around Bernie Sanders who want to be spearheading a working class movement in America today. What can they get out of canon, reading and thinking about canon's trajectory and his history?
Yeah. I think what they can get out of canon is first and foremost the importance of militant class struggle politics, the primacy of class politics. That's not nothing in today's sort of bifurcated political milieu, where I think identity politics have taken us for all the value of a variety of social movements, and the left can never advance if it doesn't actually, engage with those social movements and their meanings. But of all the identities that we've lost sight of, in America, I think at the current conjuncture, class leads them all. And yet it is about class politics, it seems to me, ultimately, that any kind of revolutionary prospects are going to emerge. Doesn't mean that women's questions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, a whole range of issues that we now know have to be addressed on the left, and that the past lefts have been inadequate in their treatment of them. But we also know from past lefts that class is also of fundamental importance. Trotsky once said, "Those who cannot defend old positions will never conquer new ones." And, I think we've lost sight of, in the current moment, a lot of, there's a whole series of reasons for this, but of the fundamental importance of class, which has always been a foundation plank of American radicalism, of the American revolutionary left.
Right. Not just the imported socialists from the Soviet Union kind, but from in the United States as well.
It's been around, from the beginnings of organized protest and struggle in the 19th century. And canon does encapsulate that in a way that's very important. He also brings to the discussion the necessity of, and here's where, of fusing American experience, internationalism, and political organization. He became a Marxist as he became more theoretically attuned and more internationally oriented in that moment of 1917, the moment of capitalist war and the Russian Revolution. And while this may seem to be ancient history and totally, irrelevant in the current moment, my view is it's not. It doesn't mean that we are going to create necessarily the structures, the institutions, the parties in the same way that they were created in Cannon's time. But it does mean that we have to actually grapple with the issues that he was grappling with and that he provided a perspective on.
I'll tell you something. All these questions that you're talking about are alive today. They're just not in the same form. They're being debated today, but they're being debated around questions like how should the American socialist left relate to China? How do you want to know, like the debates about whether the Soviet Union was a deformed worker state and what that meant. They're all being thought through again, but in relationship to contemporary China now, where there is private. I mean, the the big difference is it's not all socialized. There's some private capital in China, but it's also being thought through in a variety of other ways, like around the lockdowns and what our relationship should be with the contemporary capitalist state. I mean, these old questions come back, but we don't think about them as clearly as we should. One of the things that I'm trying to do with Sublation Media, which is this podcast is a part of, is get all the different factions of the left that are still standing to put their perspectives on the into print, either through books or on podcasts like this or in the magazine that we're running, in order for the left to be able to think things through again. And I wonder if having come out of the Trotskyist organization and knowing the history, which includes these trials, how do we avoid that? How do we avoid dogma, do you think?
Well, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
Let me
I don't expect a full answer, but it's the last question for you.
Let me cycle back to that, though, in terms of the whole question of regroupment and how one, because that's related to dogma, right. How one kind of negotiates, working with people on the left who don't necessarily at a given moment share your exact perspective. Mm-hmm. One thing that I'd like to suggest that people, you say, what can people learn? I mean, this book that I've written on canon in the 1928 to 38 period, to my mind, the most original part of that book is the discussion of how the Workers' Party that Cannon was a part of entered into the Socialist Party. The literature on the Socialist Party, written often by advocates of the Socialist Party, is often very hostile towards this Trotskyist entryist group. What Cannon did was fight within his own, at that point it was his own political grouping inside the Socialist Party, on how to actually conduct the entry. Shackman and others basically wanted to talk to what they considered to be the left-wing leadership in New York City. Cannon said, that's not going to cut it. The rest of America looks markedly different than this left-wing leadership, which turned out to be a pretty, how should I put it, facile left-wing leadership in New York City. What Cannon did was traverse the country, ended up in California, where he built up the Socialist Party, which had been practically moribund. He started a left-wing newspaper called Labor Action, which was as good an agitational paper as it's possible to imagine. He connected with the Seamen's Union there and played a fundamental role in a major strike in 1936-37. And his whole attitude was, we are in the Socialist Party now. The way we are going to show young, militant youths who've gravitated towards it and combative workers who have joined it or who are already in it is to show them that we can build up the Socialist Party better than the decrepit leadership that's in place. This won't last forever. They'll expel us, and they did. But by the time that they got expelled, Cannon and Company had basically, at least doubled, maybe tripled the membership that they'd had when they went in, because they proved to those, the left-wingers within the Socialist Party, and they did it not by being dogmatic, but by doing the work, by getting into a party that they knew was not going to be a leading element in the revolution, doing the work and showing how revolutionaries functioned. and then debating and discussing programmatic issues. Now, lest I be misconstrued, there will be those who say that's what we're doing in the Democratic Socialists of America.
Right.
Some will say this is sectarian, but I would say the Democratic Socialists of America, I know, claim that they are separate from the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that they are.
Right.
And the Democratic Party is not a party that you enter and hope to accomplish a great deal, would be my perspective.
Right.
Better that one tries to regroup the revolutionary left, reform parties, reform a revolutionary contingent, rather than disappear, I think, into the heart of the beast.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the entryism into the DSA that happened is, in retrospect, and even at the time, it was pretty obvious that it was a move done. It was a move to the right, done for out of practical concerns, fear of Trump and the reactionary right. That at the time was conceived of as being a move that would also further at least a turn back to like social democracy is understood as equivalent to the New Deal. And whereas the other option was seen to be by many to support the Democratic Party, but have no influence on its functioning, or not to get in the fight, to run your supposedly separate sectarian papers, but ultimately be a vehicle for the Democrats anyhow, like the CPUSA often is, and to basically abstain from politics, except as Democrats with your hands seemingly more clean. So I feel like before the DSA even became a major force, there was something really wrong in the American left. But and there was a need probably for recruitment then, before the DSA came along. Yeah.
No, on that we're in definite agreement.
Yeah. Listen, I enjoyed this conversation a lot. I'm going to stop the recording here. We could keep talking forever.